So this talk is, as it says right there, planning for a successful test plan. And this talk is going to focus more on the soft skills that involve testing and analysis, something we don't often get to. Just a brief agenda of what we'll go over today. We'll hit all of these to some fashion. The motivation. How is this? How do we come up with this talk? Well, a couple of things, and I'll have a couple of quotes up here, but honestly, there were several more to choose from. Right here, we got a 2000 report talking about within the statistical community, there's been a lot on, we'll say the numbers and the hard skills for your test process, but not as much on the planning that precedes it. Another article here saying that most textbooks are focusing on ANOVA, and they're not really talking about that test planning process. Whoops, I go a little too fast. Okay, and then my personal experience on assisting a couple of programs with their testing, I've had somebody say almost exactly this: hey, pop open your laptop and create some DOEs for us. Now, as we always say, the math is easy, especially today, now that we've got some very powerful software that we can use, okay? But planning is what we need in order to make this a success. Much of what I'll talk about here has a lot of lessons learned, and I've incorporated these in the brief. And if anybody has any questions along the way, please speak up and ask. I don't know that I can see the chat right now, so we'll get to that at the end if there's questions there. So again, to sort of frame today's discussion and organize it, first of all, we've got a comprehensive test program, and I've just put a block there to talk about that. All right, and we start with the requirements, and we end with decision quality information, and that's going to go into a decision. And I suspect most, if not everybody listening here, has been involved in the test program to some level. All right, but what we'll talk about today is that in order to have that great test program, it's going to start with test planning, and we're going to focus on a test planning session.
Pardon me for a second.
Sir,
your sound is coming in and out.
Okay. I will try and hold the microphone better. Closer. Okay,
Thank you.
I'll hold my microphone, and I can't wave my hands around as much. Okay.
Sorry about that.
No, great. If people can't hear us, I'm just talking to the wind. So we have a comprehensive test program, the purple block, right? And that's going to start with one of the building blocks is a good test planning session. And that's that little blue block I put in the middle. We're going to come up with goals, objectives, responses, factors, and a lot more that has been talked about. Okay? Well, now we're going to take a step back from there, and we're going to say organizing for that test planning session is another step in this. All right? So we're taking it at two levels, right? We have a test program. We need to come up with a planning session, but then we also have to have a planning session for the planning session, okay? And that's what we're going to talk about today, sort of in this area, right? How is that test planning session going to look like, okay? And how do you get ready for it? This is just one of the documents that the SSAE put out, okay? But I got to say, we're pretty much falling in line with everybody else, okay? We've done a good amount of work here, okay, on what those required deliverables are for test planning, but not, we have talked some on how to produce them, but virtually nothing on who is going to produce them or who should produce them, right? And if I could put the answer in one sentence, it's right there, right? You're going to need a diverse planning team, which is prepared to exchange knowledge, right? Learn and teach, right? And produce deliverables which are mutually acceptable to all stakeholders. And there's going to have to be give and take. Okay, and one of my colleagues has talked about this and noted that you can look at the blueprints for a house, but in those blueprints, you're not going to find any directions on how you survey the land, how do you pour the concrete, how do you splice electrical wires, hammer nails, and all that. Okay, we know what the finished product should look like, but there's really no roadmap on how to get there. So this is from the StatCOE. We call this the STAT process. It's just a variation on the scientific method or test process. We can talk all day on this, so I'm going to go very quickly. Just to mention, we start at the top with requirements, and we end at the bottom with some sort of program decision. And those two things are typically outside the purview of the test planners. All right, we don't write the requirements, we don't make the decision, but we do all the sausage making in between. Okay, some basic steps there. We do what we call the stat infusion, just talking about the different sub elements that are required there. And then we like to show there's feedback loops, right? Typically, you don't go through it top to bottom. There's going to be some replanning and retesting and all these. Okay. Again, I don't want to anchor down there. So if we look at the test planning, this is just that same slide, but I've blown up the test planning part. This is where we're going to focus today and how to make that. All right, you can see we still keep the requirements in mind, we still keep that decision in mind, but we're going to focus on what do we need to plan out a successful test. Typical things, we're going to have to understand the requirement, we're going to have to decompose our system, right? Determine our goals and our objectives for this testing. What are our responses? What can we measure when we're testing? Beyond that, what are our factors and the levels there? What are the different levers we can adjust while we're testing, and what are some constraints? There's some places we can't test. Let's figure that out. We typically say in the StatSAE, this is where you should put 80% of your effort into planning, right? And we also say this is where you think hard, right? This is where you got to put a lot of that brain power in. So what will that test planning meeting look like? Well, typically we see it's going to require multiple days. All right. Obviously, that is going to depend on your system under test, right? A very complicated one could last longer. If it's a very simple test, maybe you could do it in a day. Okay. It has to conclude with deliverables, right? This test meeting has got to be goal oriented. There is nothing worse, and I'm sure there's folks out there that can share my sentiment. There is nothing worse than a meeting that you go to and you conclude with the action, well, we weren't really ready for this meeting, so let's schedule another meeting to do it again. Oh, that's frustrating. Okay. So let's go into this with goals and deliverables. All right. I put 4 bullets here, but this is by no means comprehensive. Right. We want to convert those requirements into well-defined goals. And there's literature on that. All right. Define our responses, define the factors and the levels, identify constraints, and there's a lot more. And those are all very well documented in the textbooks and all the test planning documents. We're going to take another step and figure out what are implied tasks, right? So we got some explicit tasks there, but what are some implied tasks? And just as an example, if I look at those bottom 3, define responses, factors, levels, constraints, well, that's probably best done through a system decomposition, right? Let's really tear apart this system under test. Let's really understand it, all right? That's not listed in there, but that is an implied task, all right? And then finally, this is one that's really a lesson learned, right? This planning session is only going to succeed if you have the right people that are brought together. They are prepared to think hard and they are prepared to make decisions in this test planning session. So let's plan for it. How do we organize this successful test planning session? Well, a very basic email with, hey, test planning meeting next week, 9 o'clock, I'll bring donuts. That's not going to yield good results. Okay. And I know that, slightly better email than this, but just by casually mentioning a test planning session, the message really isn't out there. And part of that is I don't think a lot of the T&E community really appreciates the work that goes into planning for a test. All right, so you really want to have a timely announcement that's going to cover the 5 W's, right? And who, what, when, where, and why. Okay. Now you have to have a plan for the test planning meeting, and I put that out. Perhaps this is recursive, right? We could even go back. You get a plan for the test planning meeting, right? But I suppose you could go back several steps, but we're just going back those 3 steps that you saw in my slide with the blocks. All right. So you're going to start with some small core group and just have a brainstorming session, and this could be on the phone, over email. It could take place over a couple of weeks as you're getting ready for the test planning meeting, and that core group. You may want the CDT, the Chief Developmental Tester, or a Senior Test Engineer, but you want to include some folks that are motivated and they've got authority to make this test planning meeting happen, to make it have to carry weight. Planning for your test planning meeting, you want to be as deliberate and as thorough as possible, and that is very much linked with that next bullet. Clear communication is essential. All right, you want to do a lot of work up front, and you want to make sure that everybody involved in this test planning meeting understands your vision for what has to happen. They may not all agree, but it's a success if they understand what you're trying to do. So let's go into those 5 W's: who, what, when, where, why. So who, all right, you want a diverse test planning team, and that's going to include the folks with all relevant aspects of your system under test. Okay, so again, this is not a comprehensive list, but just from our experience, the types of folks we have seen that work well in here. All right, somebody from the program, some leadership or representative there. All right, systems engineers, and the bigger the system, the more folks that's going to involve, because it's going to involve more subsystems. Operational users, right? When this system is tested and fielded, let's have somebody that's going to be using operational talk about how what features are important, what features aren't important. The lab and the range operators, all right? Before we even start test planning, let's have somebody there that's going to be on the range or in the lab that understands what they could test, how long it's going to take, when they can't test, other things such as when is the lab going to be down for maintenance, when is the range going to be closed, when is it already booked. All these things go into test planning. Stat experts are coming from where we are, right? Test planning experts, the science of test experts. This next one I put in red: designated leader. That doesn't have to be one more person. In fact, I personally have never seen it be another person. It's somebody you've already got there, but one of the driving folks behind organizing and pushing this event. All right, and especially pushing the meeting, keeping that meeting, that test planning session on task and moving forward. Other folks, maintenance personnel, right? We've seen where that helps. That's if you got a test that perhaps is already fielded and you're doing an upgrade. Let's have some maintenance folks talk about typical problems or typical issues they see. Human systems integration, industry experts, if they play into a part. Logisticians and schedulers, right? If we're going to do testing on the East Coast and then the West Coast and then the East Coast, let's have somebody who actually knows how to move this stuff back and forth to make sure that we're getting realistic plans together. Safety could be a factor, and certainly more, right? There's my catch-all. It may include more. And that's going to depend on each system. Another lesson learned from me, right? Maximum participation for the entire process. And I learned this when I had a great system engineer talk about how this system's going to be tested. And then, we took a break and he never came back. And we definitely could have used that input later on. But it wasn't communicated clearly in the beginning that we need everybody for that entire process. So who, and after that is what? Well, explain to everybody what this is, right? It's a designated planning session for this entire test effort. Right? We want all those stakeholders to dedicate the time to come together. Okay? And you want to have the right people, right? We just talked about that. But you can't just put a bunch of people in the room and say plan, right? Make sure that the right people, make sure they've got the skills, okay? And make sure they've done their homework part of this planning session. And that's going to come with that clear communication early on, that everybody understands what's going to be done. And they understand what this meeting is supposed to produce, this test planning session. All right, and that is done with, it is facilitated with posting an agenda with the assignments and due dates. Talk to the systems engineers. Hey, what do you expect them to bring to the brief? What do you expect the operators to bring to the brief? So we talked about who, we talked about what, when and where. So part of the when is when should those pre-meeting deliverables be due to the organizer? Right, have your briefs into me 1 week, 1 hour, whatever it is before that planning session, just to make sure folks are prepared. Allow enough time to complete this evolution, and that's just obviously going to vary the complexity of the system under test. 3 days is about the longest I've seen it happen, and I've seen it go as short as a morning, but that was a very basic test. Location, just things to consider there. It may be best to be near a test area. Maybe it's best to be near an example of the system under test. And then, of course, there's a lot of considerations for virtual test planning meetings. I'm not going to get into. We've all been experiencing that over the past year or so. Why? Well, I think I've been explaining throughout this talk why these test planning sessions are necessary. But I'd venture to say that many of the folks who you would like to attend don't understand that why. Okay, so it's best if you can explain it to them precisely what will happen and why it is to their benefit to put that upfront time. A little quote there, right? A good test plan does not guarantee a good test, but the opposite, right? A poor test plan will nearly always lead to a poor test. We've certainly experienced that here. Some other things that this is good for, right? Identify barriers to testing early on. So there's time to identify and address them. How are you going to mitigate them, or at least get visibility of them up the chain of command? And then establish rules, roles, and responsibilities within that test team. That will make things flow a little bit smoother later on. There's not as much confusion on who's responsible for what. So we went over the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why. So let's talk about the steps to planning, right? If we think about my little 3-block diagram in the beginning, now we're all the way on the left, right? Planning the test plan. So first of all, some of you may be familiar with the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Dr. Stephen Covey, right? And his second habit was begin with the end in mind. All right. So one of the first things that's necessary, I believe, is to envision what exactly will you have when that test planning session is over. What will you have accomplished? The second bullet goes into that. You need to convey that to the test team, right? And if you can communicate that clear vision to all the test members in a timely manner so that they can show up prepared, right? They've got their briefs prepared. They know what they're going to talk about. They know what they're going to learn, and everybody understands what deliverables and what's going to be produced out of the team, out of that session. You have a much higher success then of a much higher probability of success of producing that clear test plan. Here's some examples I came up with, right? So if you can put it out to your test planning team, all right, when this test planning meeting is over, this is what we will have, right? And again, much of this is already discussed in the literature. And we'll go again a little bit more on how to do it.
Your mic's out
requirements. Oh. Go ahead, please.
Oh, no, you're good. Your mic was out again, but.
Okay. Oh, my apologies here. So a thorough understanding of the requirements, typically not as easy as it sounds, right? Identify all governing documents. There may be safety documents on how you can test. There may be MIL standards. There may be industrial standards. Figure out what is governing your test process. Need a thorough understanding of the system under test, right? That's pretty obvious. Need a thorough understanding of the interactions between your system and the operators. Understand any test resources and the capabilities. What do you have? What don't you have? Understand the decision to be made at the end, right? That's going to play into it. Is it buy or don't buy? Is it reject, or accept with limitations? What is it? Understand what that decision is that is required to be made. Understand who's going to make it. Have a good timeline, right? Any deadlines to the testing over the program. This is the next one big. Agreed upon test goals and objectives, right? I have certainly seen where, we say this is the objective of testing, and you come back to another planning meeting a month later, and you'll have much of the same people sit back and say, no, that wasn't the objective, right? So get everybody to agree on it, and then I'll stomp on it again, write it down, record it. Right, responses and factors, we've talked about that as one of the key elements to planning. A communications plan. So I put this up. This was another big lessons learned where we were testing, doing test effort, and one of the folks in the lab talked to his friend about, hey, this is interesting what we found, and the friend talked to his friend who was the general and said, oh, we found the solution to the problem, and through unintended consequences, some resources started to get moved around out of some spurious and not quite, I'll say, incomplete information. A lot of that, those sort of problems can be avoided if in the planning session you come up with a communications plan. This is the agency or the person that can release information about our testing and nobody else can. And I'm not talking about any classification or security, right? This is just to make sure that complete analyzed information goes out not the incomplete stuff, which can lead to the consequences that we had. A data collections plan, right? I've seen some excellent collections plans talking about, this is how we're going to label our test results, right? So the day, the test, and what the factors were. So come up with a plan on how you're going to record your data, where's it going to be stored. A record of assumptions. This is another one because coming in and looking at test plans already created, oftentimes our teams looked at it and say, well, why did that test team decide to do this or choose these factors or not vary this factor? And I'm sure there's always a good reason for it. But what was that reason? What were those assumptions, and are they still valid? So record it, right? And I'm sure whatever assumptions you come up with, I guarantee some will be wrong, right? But record what you were thinking is at that time, and as assumptions change, you can change the plan. Record any missing information or corrective actions that need to take place, right? What did we not find out at the meeting? And you'll never have a 100% successful test planning session. That's just a given. But at least identify what you did not get out of that test planning session. Identify any testing shortfalls, right? Maybe there's parts of this testing effort that you cannot do. Well, identify it early on. And then number 16, the catch-all, right? Anything unique to your test effort, because they're all different. This is an example agenda we came up with. We were testing OBOGs, onboard oxygen generating system for an aircraft. And it went quite well. And this was not the first attempt. It took a few attempts to sort of organize this. It was a 2-day event, full 2 days. And so generalized here without putting any specific information, right? We first got everybody together. This was a live meeting. Everybody got in the same room. All right, we reviewed the tasking order. What was the problem we were tasked to come up with? And we then came up with a very succinct problem statement that everybody in the room agreed on. All right, we reviewed the MIL standard that is required of oxygen supply systems, and then SFF, a safe for flight document, right? These are two different things, but let's review them. What is required for the oxygen system for the MIL standard, and then what is required for something to be determined safe for flight, right? Then we did a decomposition of the system. We had some really good engineers who came with well-prepared briefs and explained to everybody in the room what all of those pieces were within that system and how they all worked. This was an eye-opener for me. Then we also had some folks, or one person from that headed up a maintenance shop talk about it. And the interesting thing here was the chief engineer and this maintenance representative they both had a surprising event where they learned something from the other side, saying, I didn't know that. I didn't realize that's the way it was designed, or that's how you took care of that. So already learnings occurred. Then we had some flight physiologists talk about what happens when a human is breathing in this generated air. What happens in their lungs? What are some good things? What are some bad things? What are some problems we suspect? What do you want to avoid? Again, great information. Then we had some folks come in and talk about the aircrew equipment. And they went above and beyond. They brought in a mannequin completely dressed in all the flight equipment, and everybody's able to go around, look at it, touch it, understand how it works. Right? We had the briefs earlier where that was just a little box on a flow chart up on the screen, but now they could actually look at that, touch it, understand it a little more. We were dealing with 2 OBOX test laboratories, so we had folks from each of those labs come in, talk about what they've done in the past, and then the capabilities and shortcomings of each of their different laboratories. I guess I got a little ahead of myself. That's when we came up with that problem statement and objectives, right? What exactly are we trying to test here? And then went into the responses, factors, limitations, the hard skills there of test planning. And then there was a review of action items, and I can't recall at this point, but there were things we did do, right? So we talked about it then. Hey, this is the information we're missing, and you over there, you're responsible for getting this piece and this piece. So this was a good success story that we've had. I have had other stories that were less of a success, and I go all the way back to I didn't put the effort into clearly communicating my vision of what should happen in the end. And certainly the results were obvious. Folks came without that, didn't put in the effort, and we had to do a lot of catch up after that meeting. Just to real briefly, what is the StatCOE? I typically lead with this, but I put it at the end because I wasn't sure if I would have enough time to get to it. But we're at, under the Office of Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. We assist ACAT 1 programs, so major defense acquisition programs, infuse rigor into their test planning. I like to point out we are not oversight, right? We just help. We don't sign off on anything, and you don't have to please us. We just help the program. We work for the test planning effort there. With the StatCOE, I had a link earlier, but we've got a lot of best practices. Right? How do you find the goals? How do you find the factors and set the levels? A lot of that stuff. We've got some interactive tools on R and Excel and other programs. And then finally, we've just got to ask a question part. Ask a stat, send in the question, and we can certainly assist with any small or even moderately large problems that are out there. My basic conclusions here. Begin with the end in mind, right? And I like the phrase, when this planning session is over, we will have, and list it out exactly what it is. Rolling into the next one, communicate your vision. Okay, it's not easy enough, or it's not good enough just to throw some people in a room, right? They have to be the right people with the correct information, and they have to be prepared for their briefs and prepared to make decisions. And then finally, document everything. Document it all. I don't have my watch in front of me, so I don't know how much time that took, but I'm prepared to take any questions at this time.
So we have a couple minutes. I had one question.
Certainly.
There was I was really interested when you were talking about that initial planning and when you're the who, right?
Yes.
There was a lot of good people listed. The one question I had was that designated leader. Is there, like, should they have some sort of like Six Sigma background? Like, are you what I guess qualities are you looking for that person that's going to kind of like lead it?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know that I've completely fleshed that out. So in most, actually, I think all of the planning sessions that I've been involved in, it's been somebody from our office. And I'll say the biggest skill they had, I don't know if it's a skill, but the biggest element they had was just a very clear vision of what has to happen at the meeting. And then just the ability to keep it on task. For example, in one of the test planning sessions, somebody spoke up and he said, well, I understand all that, but these requirements are ridiculous. I think we need to rewrite the requirement. And you have to be able to step in and say, well, the requirements may be ridiculous, but that is outside the purview of what we're doing here, right? These are the requirements we're stuck with. All right, so let's make the lemonade out of these lemons. Let's deal with what we've got and push forward. That perhaps kind of answered the question.
No. That was good. And I mean, I was thinking Six Sigma just because a lot of that kind of holding things organized, task, putting things in the parking lot, all those types of things all come into play. Because you're absolutely right. Meetings, I've been in many a meeting that got out of hand.
Yes. And as I said before, the worst ones are the ones where they say, all right, so we agree, we got to have another meeting. And you say, well, why were we here in the first place?